facile treatment of religion as wish fulfillment is so patently stupid that you'd almost have to be willfully ignorant or blind to affirm it. In what sense is Christianity wish fulfillment? That we want these things to be true, that our deepest self finds great consolation in a text that says that there is something alienatingly wrong with us from birth, and the only way that it can be adjusted accordingly is for us to turn against the very short-shrifted ways we try to find pleasure and happiness, so as to reattach to a center that forgives us, but not based on merit, when all we live for is merit. I mean, none of those things fits within a wish fulfillment.
Welcome back to the Evangelical Anglican. I'm Jared Jones. I'm your host. I'm going to start trying to do these little intros so I can talk to you before we kind of get into the actual interview for the day. Haven't been doing any videos for a while. We had a baby, and then we had the holidays. And so at that point, I just said, let's just wait till we get into the new year, and then we'll start. We got to start putting out videos. So we got our first one of the year. I'm really excited about some videos we have coming out. I'm really enjoying doing the interviews. Wouldn't mind kind of going back, if I have time, to doing some of the Bible studies and maybe some long form content. I've kind of talked about doing that. So that's all in the works. But today we've got an interview with Ethan Magness. Ethan is the rector of Grace Anglican Church in Grove City, Pennsylvania. He is one of my favorite preachers, one of the most interesting preachers. I think being in ministry and going through seminary, and I grew up in church. My dad was a pastor. I've been around church all my life. I've been around preaching all my life. I mean, it's very rare that you find preachers that you're really interested by, because a lot of times, and that's not saying like, oh, I don't mean that in a cocky way, because there's a million preachers that are way better than me. So it's not that. It's more just like you just hear a lot of sermons. I went to Christian high school, Christian college, seminary, church, worked in churches. You end up hearing a ton of sermons. So it's rare when you have a preacher who really is interesting. But Ethan is interesting. And then you have a problem where you have like a preacher who's interesting, but is not orthodox. Like they're interesting because they're heretical. They're interesting because they're lying. And Ethan's not none of those things. He's an Orthodox, committed Protestant, Reformed Christian, who is very interesting and has an interesting approach, an interesting take on Christianity without changing the story. And so he approaches it in a really fresh way, which allows me to actually be ministered to when I listen to his sermons. And so today we had a great conversation about preaching, about the heart of preaching, talk a little bit about the message of the gospel, what it really is, and how there really is kind of a canon within the canon, which I know a lot of Reformed people might not be super comfortable with. But that's the beauty of being Anglican. We can kind of pivot. We can be Lutheran when we want to be Lutheran. We can be Reformed, go back and forth. So it's a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed having Ethan on. I hope you enjoy it. In the middle of it, my computer battery died because it was plugged in, but it wasn't charging for some reason. So there's a little edit in the middle. And I kicked my my iPhone stand a couple times. So we're working on it, and I recorded all this on a different microphone. New microphone coming in. Errors being fixed. We're kicking off the new year just like it should be, with just complete mess. So bear with me on all of that. But I didn't want you to not have this content. I think Ethan is someone that everybody should listen to when he talks about preaching. There is a Freud quote at the end of the interview that is just absolutely amazing. So stay tuned for that. Today, I'm excited to have Ethan Magness, who's the rector at Grace Anglican. Is it just Grace Anglican Church, or is it Grace Anglican Grove City?
Grace Anglican Church, but it
Why
happens
don't
to be
you
in
should
Grove
just
City.
call it like Grove City Church? You
I
know,
should. I
those
should.
are the cool church
We'll
names these
we'll
days.
consider that. I know. I should call it Crossfire or something. But no.
No, that's your political podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Crossfire with Ethan
Totally. It's
Magness.
very exciting. Yeah.
But Ethan, you've been the rector, so you planted Grace Anglican.
Yeah. Yeah.
How long ago? What was the story of planting that?
Yeah, we planted in 2006, but there were things that predated that. And one of them was that Gillis Harp, who's a professor of history here at the college, recently retired, started meeting with the Canterbury Fellowship on campus for several years. They were having small gatherings in which they would hire a priest to come in occasionally to do communion, and that sort of tilled the soil a little bit to see if there was any interest. Turns out there was. And then when I was a senior at seminary, I had a friend of mine who was the rector of a church in Cranberry Township, which is about a half hour away from Grove City, a little more. And he was having some people travel from Grove City all the way down to his parish Sunday after Sunday and said, "Hey, Ethan, would you like to plant a church in Grove City?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Would you pray about that though, at least? Because, I think there might be a calling here." And I said, "No," because I didn't want to. And I know what happens when you pray about things, you soften up. And my wife kindly said, "Well, you're going to be like a Christian minister, so maybe you should pray. I don't know, just a thought." And so I did. And the more I did and the more we did, the more we felt compelled to do that. Now, Grove City back then, when we were in the Episcopal Church, was like outside the diocesan boundary, but Slippery Rock, the neighboring town, was within it. So we planted there originally with just a group of 5 or 6 people. And that was in 2006. And so it's been 20 years. As of
Wow.
this April, 20 years. Yeah, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah. So that's grown, though. I mean, from watching your YouTube channel, it's not 5 to 6 people anymore. I mean, it looks like I mean, how many people are you having a week?
Yeah, I mean, summers are so we have about 300 undergraduates at Grace, and they're not there in the summer, right? So that dims the average a bit. But I would say, like, when students are there and when our residents are there, like that average, like when we have more of a full group, is about 550 to 600.
550 to 600 a week. How many services do you do?
We do 2. We have the worst worship times in all of Christendom. We meet at 8:30 a.m. and 5 p.m. So the worst ever. But we rent a space from a really gracious group of people. It's a Lutheran church in the area that have given us a very reasonable rate. And so we're renters right now. That won't always be the case, hopefully, but like right now we are, and it's worked. I mean, it's not ideal, but it works. Yeah.
You've had this church at 550 people a week, and your service times are 8:30 and 5 o'clock.
Yeah, I know.
Wow, that's amazing.
Hopefully that'll change, in the future. But right now,
I think that does go to show, like,
dealt.
half the stuff that we worry about or we tinker with, or it really isn't the main thing.
No,
right?
it's like it's tertiary at best, like some of these things. Yeah. But the very things that cause vestries to yell at each other are the very things that don't matter.
Yeah. So, and that leads us to why I wanted to talk to you, because the one thing that really, I mean, one of the few things that really does matter. And I think one of the things that I think you would say that Grace has probably been built on is really vibrant preaching. You and I think everyone on your team seems like preaching is preaching there is not like an 8-minute homily that you have to do before conducting the mass, which is the main thing.
You are describing the truth in our local context. Yes.
So and the reason why I want to talk to you, I think recently on Twitter somebody asked, like, who's your favorite Anglican preacher, or who's your favorite preacher or whatever, and I mentioned you. And there is something about your preaching that is you weave this, like, it's intellectually stimulating, but It doesn't feel like a lecture. It is culturally relevant, but it doesn't feel like a grab bag of cultural references. Like
Quoting you
eh,
two again for the 200th
right,
time this year.
right. And it's um your sermons really are emotional. Like they evoke emotion. But they don't feel like that's the only thing that they're trying to do. And I think you weave those together really well. So that's what I just want to talk to you about. Like, why do you think preaching is so important um, for the life of a church?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it's very core to at least, and it certainly it goes, it traverses far beyond this, but it's very core to the Anglican Reformation simply because when the Church of England was being reformed in the 16th century, sermons given by clergy were very rare. I mean, they happened in collegiate chapels, they happened via the lips of bishops in cathedrals on occasion, but most of what happened was just the recitation of the mass. Most of the clergy were illiterate, and so they just had it memorized, and so but there were no sermons. And so when Cranmer and others had written homilies to be preached, just because they didn't trust the people to preach anything because they had never done it, like that was a big phenomenon in our tradition, saying we have to reground this thing not just on the word read, but the word expounded. And so it's been a massive part of our tradition. And in fact, up until the late 70s, with the advent of the new prayer book in the Episcopal Church, morning prayer with a long sermon was the typical service on a Sunday morning. That was only replaced by the redubbed Eucharistic service after the
Right.
1970s. And that made sermons have a more diminished role, to the point where I've heard so many Anglican and Episcopal rectors joke that their sermon preparation is the gradual hymn before the gospel lesson. And so it's lost some of its emphasis. And I think our church attendance and church energy and vitality has shown the fruit of that divergent path that we really should abandon. Like that path has proven it did not work.
Right.
This kind of overemphasis on liturgy and finery, and it's romance, but it's not real. So, so I think that it goes actually. So, but I mean, that's where it started in our tradition. I think before that, of course, it's central to the New Testament's vision, like the proclamation of the word. If you just even look at the biblical texts that talk about the proclamation of the word, in comparison even to the presentation of the sacraments, one outweighs the other very clearly and very textually. That's not me diminishing the role of the sacraments at all,
How
because
dare you?
they
How
too
dare
are, I
you?
know, right? They too are physicalized proclamations. But the proclamation of the word is central in the New Testament. It's
Right.
unavoidably so.
Yeah.
Like it is, like the Eucharist is not the source and summit of the faith. The proclamation of the word is the source and summit of the faith according to the New Testament.
Yeah. Well, wow. Okay. Well, that's we're starting off really really good there. Yeah, it is fascinating how little is talked about communion, and baptism. They're kind of assumed, and
Yeah,
they're definitely ordinances that are commanded.
yep, certainly,
Um,
and they're important,
but I mean,
crucial.
Acts is a bunch of sermons connected by narratives. I mean, really, like it's a bunch of like uh moments of public preaching where you get these pictures of what they were preaching, and then a narrative that kind of connects you to the next sermon. And
Yeah,
and it all is focused on the cross. And you
yeah,
you make a big deal out of there's a sermon you gave, a commencement address at Trinity. What's the Trinity Anglican Seminary? Is
yeah.
that what it's called now?
Redubbed recently. Yeah,
Yeah. Which I guess is near you.
yeah. I would say it's about an hour away.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
near Pittsburgh. Yeah,
Yeah. So you gave a commencement address. I'll link it for those listening. Where you and this kind of what I was thinking we could frame our discussion around. You have two main points in the sermon. You're talking to future ministers who are getting ready to or studying, beginning their studies, or beginning their studies, or graduating. Commencement, I guess, would be graduating.
yeah. They've all wrapped up. Yeah.
All right, so they're done. They're on their way out. And you gave them an address to kind of frame that, and you talked about the basically the weakness of the cross and the weakness of the preacher. And I was just thinking about that those two, like both the message and the messenger. Um, and for the message, um, you make a big deal about the importance of and the centrality of preaching the cross. Where did that come about, and how do you understand that?
Yeah. For me, it's sheerly exegetical. Like, so in Luke 24, when the risen Jesus meets with the apostles after his devastation and resurrection, they have this Bible study where he does two things. The first is he trains them in hermeneutics and then homiletics. So in hermeneutics, he says you have to look at the entirety of the Old Testament, not the New, which hadn't been written, but the Old Testament, in terms of the law, the writings, and the prophets, and you have to understand them Christologically and cruciformly, or else you fail to understand them. So Jesus gives them a hermeneutic that's passion oriented and unavoidably so. So all the tributaries lead to the oceanic Christ and his bloodletting. It's just how he interprets the Bible, and he trains them to do so. And then he says, in light of that, you are to proclaim a message of repentance and for the forgiveness of sins. That's the heart of the message that comes from that hermeneutical conclusion. And so I think to view the scripture in any other way, whether it's a call to sort of political action on the one hand, or a pietistic self-obsessed, have I grown in my love for Jesus every 7 seconds perspective, is to diminish and damage the textual intent. The text is not so interested in your hyper neurotic understanding of internal development, nor is it really interested in every new political cause that comes out every 3 seconds that the church has to seem relevant by attaching itself to. That seems dumb and a waste of
If you
time.
don't, if your pastor doesn't talk about this Sunday, then you
Oh
should
yeah,
find a
then you
new
should leave
church.
your church. Um, yeah, ironic that some of those personalities on the internet claiming such a thing were in posts in which they horribly abused their underlings for years. And so I would take their advice as much as I would take Satan's advice. But that aside, to not speak too hyperbolically, that aside, I just think Jesus gives us a hermeneutic as well as a homiletical model, and therefore, in light of that dominical command from Luke 24, we have no choice other than to understand the text as Jesus did. And so to do otherwise really damages the homiletical cause. And so for me, everything in terms of my preaching emphasis goes back to that moment in the New Testament. And by the way, St. Paul seems to have deduced the same instincts, even though he didn't have that conversation with Christ in Luke 24. His methodology is clearly cruciform. Even his ethical um, exhortations at the end of his letters are derived from this death and resurrection of Christ as central, and so everything in the New Testament is cruciform, and Jesus thought everything in the Old Testament was cruciform. So for me, that's huge in terms of
Yeah,
my own understanding.
yeah. So you preach that way because the Bible tells us to preach that way. But there's also, and I don't want to. That is the main reason to do it. I think there's an added benefit too, of, and I would love to hear you because I've heard you speak on this. I mean, what's the what's the existential benefit of hearing the message of listeners hearing the message of the cross rather than hearing what you mentioned, how to love God better than you did 7 seconds ago, or what, 7 steps to improving your finances,
Yeah,
or the kind of other stuff that you might hear from a sermon, or how to solve world hunger.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, what effect does the message of the cross have on a listener that's that benefits?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it goes back to an insight that was originally Augustine's, that was certainly present in Bernard of Clairvaux, was megaphoned in Luther, which is this distinction between law and gospel is really important. And I mean those terms, I'm just going to use at least the law term broadly. I think originally it certainly means the sign of covenant, but more broadly just the should of life. And maybe you should deal with something regarding poverty in your neighborhood, and maybe you ought to have a more earnest and regularized prayer life and all these things. But Luther thought that all of the 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 should energy doesn't necessarily alter the concourse of the human heart. In fact, it usually agitates and bifurcates human nature, causing you to appear one way but function at a very deeper, darker level. Um, uh, um, Freud taught this too. So did Jung, about the division between either superego or id, or the division between shadow and light, the shadow and light self. And so St. Paul just notices that too, and it's traced out by those great reformers and those great heroes of the faith. But what their point was is you can tell people what to do all the time, and it could be even be right ethically. It could be right biblically, but that doesn't make the heart want to do it. And so the benefit of the gospel is that it's a message that says your heart is in, intrinsically blended with the light and the dark, the image of God and the image of darkness. And you are a complex composite of both. And the only thing that can sort that out and begin to mend and heal is the message that through the horrific death and unique resurrection of Jesus, that heaven has demonstrated its 100% solidarity and love for you as you are, not as you should be. And only that kind of love alters the heart to say, wow, I do feel lighter. And I
Mm,
think I really could. I mean, why not? Why I could try new things in new ways. I won't die. And if I screw up, who cares? Like,
right.
it's already been
Right.
dealt with. So I think that undergirding and strong foundation of immovable pardon, 200 proof redemption, is the only grounds upon which you begin to have gusto. I think everything else causes Pharisaism. And the law
Mm,
by itself creates Pharisaism. I mean, that's the
yeah.
New Testament and certainly Book of Romans contention. So, so that's my thought, is that the Renaissance place always is connected to redemption. And without that, your sermons can really hurt people.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the law gospel distinction, I think, is it's central to preaching for like actual pastoral care, to be to actually care for your people. You have to be able to distinguish between these two. And
Absolutely.
I think people miss a lot when they talk about the law gospel um distinction, um that somehow we're saying that you should be lax on the shoulds, you know. um and the way
No.
I see it is more like, no, you just need to be aware of what the shoulds do,
Totally.
and what you are actually, how people hear the law versus, again, it's like, um there's a line from The Big Lebowski, where John Goodman's character, is yelling at Jeff Bridges' character, saying, "Am I wrong? Am I wrong?" And the dude says, "No, Walter, you're just an asshole." And there's a sense of, I think sometimes people react against the law gospel saying, "I have every right to preach. It's the word of God. I can preach the law." And it's like, yes, and I'm not saying that you're an asshole if you preach the law, but I am saying it's not just, I have a right to preach this and this is right, but it's more, yes, okay, but yes, what is it doing?
Yeah, you
How
just
is
know it's
it
coming.
affecting
Yeah.
people?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and Luther's great insight was basically that he thought, I argue that he combined what later Reformed divines called the first and the third use of the law. I think Luther combined them in what he almost regarded as a creational use, meaning the moral law of the Bible just demonstrates what creational reality is. Like, you can hate it, you can fight it, but it is what it is. You can hate gravity too, and it still wins. So it's just reality, and then it convicts you rightly whenever you act out of accordance with reality. And I think those two uses summarize the sort of theological limits and also benefits of the law. Like, it's good that it does those things, but it can't do more than that. So, and that's fine. It doesn't need to fix you, and it was never intended to. And so, is if you know that, then you can preach it for what it's worth, and that's
yeah,
great. But it just can't
yeah,
end there. Yeah.
right. Um, what is, when you're preaching? I mean, what is your goal? Um, and I'm sure there's a couple goals. What's your kind of framework for, like, your goal in a sermon is to do
Yeah.
what?
Yeah, I mean, I have three. I always tell our clergy this at the church, but also I try to encourage our seminarians to abide by these things. The first is just to take I take an individual biblical pericope, so I don't do this golden thread of preaching where you try to tether together all 4 lessons. Like in our tradition, you often read 3 or 4 lessons per Sunday,
Right.
and
Right.
some of them don't have anything to do with each other. I mean, I know that people try to make that fit, but sometimes they don't. And like to find a golden thread, sometimes that means you forgive the infelicitous term, but you half-ass all your preaching because you're not really preaching any of the text seriously. You're just too busy trying to find some thread. So I do one passage. So I try to. That's the first goal: is how do you unpack the brilliance of a particular pericope? Then how do you connect it to Christ in a definitive way? And lastly, how do you existentially connect with your hearers, particularly with their suffering? Because I just assume that everybody in the church is 5 bad days away from a nervous breakdown. Now, not everybody is, but actually more people are than you think. Like. And so I'm trying to really speak to the Rocky Horror Picture Show of human existence, and to do that in hopefully a fresh and compelling way. So I have those 3 goals of taking the text seriously, leading to Christ, and then connecting with people pastorally through their own agony.
Yeah. How do you know how do you know when you've taken the text seriously enough? I mean, I think that's what a lot of young preachers get so caught up in the text because there's a never-ending well of.
Yeah,
I mean, you could write a
bottomless
PhD
genius.
on every single one, or a dissertation on every single one. So how do you know when you have that sense of like, okay, I got it,
Yeah.
let's move on. Let's move to these next steps.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, right? With most passages, you could preach 2 or 3 decent and faithful sermons from them, right? Just in terms of taking some different angles or different sections of the pericope. Um, Sometimes I'll begin by saying that. I'll begin by saying, look, this passage is so rich, like you could go in a variety of directions. This is going to be my direction. So I self-select in front of them, showing them that there's much more brilliance here, but I can't deal with everything. So I'm going to deal with this. Um, because you're right. The new preacher tries to do too much. Now, I still do that on occasion. Like, it's just part of me. Like, I find it all interesting, so I want to talk about it all.
Right.
But
Right.
that actually, you lose your hearers because it's like you're feeding them a 19-course meal. I mean, they could maybe eat 3 courses, but they can't eat 19, and they'll forget most of it anyway. So I find I don't want to be hyper simplistic in preaching because I've heard sermons that almost see the text as a springboard that they jump away from. Like, oh, this is an interesting text because it leads me to speak about what I was going to speak about anyway. So it's barely even referred to. I think that's really tragic. Like, I think sermons ought to be more expositorily guided than that. Uh, um, but at the same time, you can get lost in exposition where you're parsing Greek verbs in a way that people are, and it's and part of that also comes from the insecurity of the preacher if they want to show themselves to be more intelligent than the parishioners. Like whenever you hear people talking about the Corinthian correspondence, they're sending a message that I know more than you do. Um,
Right.
and that's
Right.
dumb. Yeah,
Right.
like that has more to do with ego. So I think there's a few things the new preachers running into, and so I think honing, like the greatest discipline of preaching is deciding what not to say,
Mm.
because you could say all sorts of things,
Right.
but what's on your cutting room floor, because you can then sweep up those cuttings and use them at a later time.
Right.
But yeah,
You the you mentioned expository. How do you you're not I don't want to say you're not an expository preacher. You're not a line by line
that's right. Yeah,
preacher. Like I'm just going to walk you through this text, but so how do you do expository driven preaching,
yeah,
um but not necessarily that type
line by
of
line.
kind of line by line.
Yeah, I don't think true expository preaching is line by line. I think that particularized model has co-opted the term in a way that's really unhelpful. Like expository preaching ought to be more intelligent. And what I mean by that is it ought to involve a minister sitting down with the Bible and asking themselves, what is the main purpose of this pericope? And how do I demonstrate that clearly from the text? And how do I then exposit that main meaning? Because the Bible is not the Quran. We do not read the Bible as in that every word is equal to every other word. Pericopes have central ideas and themes. And so the question is, you have to be a better reader and choose the central theme wisely as you read it, under the Spirit's direction and under your godly wisdom, and then proclaim that. I find that line by line thing to be actually anti-biblical, in the sense that the Bible isn't written that way. It's not written to be every verse to be expounded upon equally. And by the way, every expositor who does that model knows this, because they don't do it in the book of Numbers. They don't really care about the number of Amalekites. Like, they
Right.
don't weigh that equal. So I think that all scripture is equally inspired, but it's not all equally uh,
Important.
important.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's
To
not
to the
that's not a
preaching
slam on
task.
scripture. No,
Right.
and yeah, it's not all central to the homiletical text.
Yeah, I think our the Anglican collect around scripture kind of shows us that, of, who caused all holy scripture to be written for our learning, but he directs it towards that we might receive that blessed hope of everlasting life. Like, it's not written just to the scripture was not given just to give us some interesting information or even just some
not
true
trivia.
information.
Yeah, that's right.
It was written to point us towards eternal life.
Yeah, it's Luther's
Like
line, the
that
true
which we.
theology is not for it's not for speculation, but for life and breath.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so how would you prevent, how would you like answer maybe the accusation that in and of itself creates like a canon within the canon, where you're.
Sure. The canon, I would say the canon already does that.
I like it, yeah.
So in St. Paul's one and only paradoka definition of the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15, paradoka meaning a tradition that was given to him in a technical sense. He said that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, was buried, and rose again according to the scriptures. But then before that, he said, this is of first importance. Well, how could he say it's of first importance? Isn't everything of first importance? Well, no, everything is not of first importance. Hence, St. Paul qualifying that the center of the canon is the Christ of the canon. And so all biblical tributaries have to lead to the oceanic Christ. And so, in a sense, the Bible already does that for us. That doesn't mean the book of Numbers is unimportant. It just means it has its voice, its choral voice that cries out for the eventual fulfillment of the Christ. And so I think to do otherwise, actually, to read it Quranically is to read it unbiblically, because after all, St. Paul says there are some things that are of first importance.
Yeah.
And that's in the
Yeah.
Bible. So
Yeah.
like, it's
Yeah.
unbiblical
And,
to think of things as not of first importance,
right.
or as everything of first importance, because it's not.
Right. And how, Christ says that the scriptures taught that it was necessary that the Messiah suffered.
Yeah.
That linkage to what the scriptures pointed towards, which they don't point to. The Old Testament doesn't just say, by the way, it's necessary that the Messiah should suffer, every single line. No one expected the Messiah to suffer until afterwards. He points back and says, actually, the scriptures pointed to this.
Yes.
So there
And
is
then they
a message underneath
Oh,
the
yeah.
message.
Yeah, it's the great subterranean nature of the Christ event, is that then afterward, it's the whiplash. And after you receive the whiplash, all of a sudden your astigmatized eyes, for whatever reason, go 20/20, and now you can see. You can look back and say, wow, now some things make sense. Now it makes sense why there's this sacrificial system and this re-Edenic nature of the temple, and all of these things come into play. Isaiah 53, suffering servant songs, all of these things, the crying out for a true monarch in the Psalter, the fresh water in Ezekiel coming and flowing from the new temple. All these things then become clear. But you need the Christ event in order to clarify.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not just I think when people maybe I won't abstract it. When I first started trying to preach the cross, law gospel, it felt like or like Christ-centered preaching was really popular 10 or 15 years ago. Maybe it's still, I don't know. It felt like and I remember one of the first pushbacks that I had against it when I was in seminary, and I was, and people were all talking about Christ-centered preaching. I thought,
Yeah.
it feels like you're just taking a sermon, you're talking about a lot of things, and then you just like slap Jesus onto the end, and call it Christ-centered preaching because, well, yeah, the main sermon was all about this other thing, but then at the end I just kind of punted towards the cross.
Yeah, I've heard it done that way. Yeah.
I mean, how do we not do that?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I think the preacher almost needs to be possessed by the great enduring center, or else that's what you do. It just becomes another kind of uh it becomes another fad that you just adopt, and then you try to sort of redeem what has been thus far an irredemptive sermon by capping it with Christ. But if the plane is going down for about 25 minutes, it's actually not enough in the last 2 minutes to pull up, because you're going to hit the mountain anyway. You've already
right,
led people into clinical depression. You're probably not going to save them in the last 2 minutes by trying to. So in other words, the preacher needs to have a prolegomena understanding of the homiletical craft, as the entirety of this thing is really about proclaiming Christ and him crucified and risen, and all of his justifying and redeeming effects. And if you begin with that assumption, and you know that the entirety of this text is really going to lead to that place, it will change how you preach the entirety of your sermon, not just the tail end of it. Because you're right, that was my fear of all of these new fads, including the kind of grace preaching and Christ-centered preaching, even though I believe in those things,
right,
but I've heard them done badly.
right.
Yeah.
Do you think the best kind of preaching is, I mean, this might be a bad question, but um I think sometimes in our mind we think the best kind of preaching is direct. It's in your face. The bold preachers are like in your face, direct, hitting you with the truth. Um but one of the things I like about you and your preaching is you are direct about the human condition, but you are indirect, and there's almost a subterfuge of um, it's kind of like Nathan with David. He, he doesn't hit him directly in the face with um, this is what you've done. He rather kind of allows David to process it separately, where his defenses go down, and then he's able to hit him with
Man.
the you
Yeah.
are the man. Um, do you think good preaching should actually be um, more indirect and more uh, allowing people to kind of process something outside of themselves?
I think there may be times for directness, but I find that a lot of preachers overplay that hand. And in part, if I were to play armchair analyst, I would say it's because they're projecting, like they're yelling
Mm.
at themselves.
Right,
They
right, right.
know that they're absolutely aberrant when it comes to these things, and they're trying to actually fix their inner life by screaming at themselves through
Yeah,
the poor people that sit in their pews and somehow endure it week after week. I actually find that kind of preaching to be psychologically stunted, but also I find it to be adolescent, adolescent in the sense of it's almost bullying. And it certainly infantilizes the audience, and so I find it sort of it's grist. It's sort of annoying grist. The only time where that works is if the preacher leads with his or her weakness and say, "Look, I'm with you, and this is a devastated area of my own life." You don't have to get hyper specific in some exhibitionistic, weird way where you make people feel uncomfortable, but to say, "Look, like I have um, I have my own scar tissue all over my soul, and I'm with you in this, but I think that these are issues that we have to face at some point." I think if you lead that way, that's okay, but sort of like a school marm yelling at your people, thinking that's going to alter their course, uh, is is infantilizing
yeah. But
and
what if you're yelling about liberals? Is it okay
that doesn't
then?
help anybody. Yeah, no, I know, but no, it's funny. I hear that too. There's also a governing assumption in lots of preaching um, that culture out there will be cured by me yelling at people in here who don't often share the values of the culture out there, whatever that means. Actually, they do. They're just afraid to tell you. And more than that, no one out there is listening to you anyway. So you're
Right,
not doing anything.
Right.
Nothing. So, that doesn't mean that I find that we can't as Christians say, look, as as the people of God in this particular time, we can notice things about our cultural moment that are really great and that are really sketch and that are really, uh, really damaging. Then, and those things, though out there, are also a part of us, and so we just need to like not be haughty because we can easily be duped into all sorts of craziness because
Right.
that's we're good at that. Yeah, I find that that kind of culture warrior preaching tends to divide congregations, but also it fails to notice that the world is also in here and that the world out there that you are so antagonized against isn't listening to you anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that I saw a sermon recently with I'm not going to mention who it was, but they're a big online Twitter right wing guy, and it was just him. Um, yeah, doing exactly it was just him yelling at his congregation about people that aren't in the room, and will never be in the room.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want in the room about how we're not them, and there was, and I thought, one, what does this have to offer towards someone who showed up hurting and
Yeah.
in any kind of pain,
Yeah.
um, how do you, and I thought too, like, okay, where does the preacher really have to be to not care about that, to not think about who's in the room, and
Yeah.
and I realized, and it's something I did for a long time, which was preaching the temptation for preachers to preach to people who
Yeah.
aren't actually in the room, you know, and what I mean, he was preaching to people in the room, but preaching his main concern, and forget him. My main concern, there was plenty of times in my life where my main concern was, I want to make sure this gets recorded and I could put it out on YouTube, or I could put it out on, or I could send it to, I want to make sure this is a great sermon for out there, but I'm not really all that concerned with communicating to the hearts and people of the people who are in here, or the solace that they can find in
Yeah.
Christ. I'm more concerned with creating a good sermon.
Yeah. 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 I find one of the dangers that I felt within myself and certainly have seen within others is whenever you're angry in your sermon or in your prep, just take note of it. Like, who are you arguing against and why? Because they're not listening and they're not there. And even if they are there, they're not going to hear you anyway because usually people's pathologies cause a sort of deafness when it comes to those kind of intense remarks. And they always think you're talking about somebody else anyway. So it never really hits them. And I find that in my prep and in my preaching, when I'm angry, I need to be careful because I'm normally trying to address or fix something that cannot be fixed by the means that I am now employing. So, and that's why I worry about ranty preachers, finger pointing preachers, screaming preachers. And people can say, well, Ethan, isn't John the Baptist a screaming preacher? All I would say is you are not John the Baptist. Like John the Baptist was a particular person
Yeah.
of whom Jesus said, "There's been none greater born of
Right.
women." You
Right.
are not that man. He had a
Right.
particular ministry, and so salvation history, you do not share it.
Right.
Sorry.
Sir, I
Wah
know
wah.
John the Baptist. I'm friends with John the
Than
Baptist.
you, sir.
You know John the Yeah, it's yeah, I think people, and does John the Baptist characterize the breadth of biblical preaching? You know. Um no, not really. Yeah, what's a common what are some of the common mistakes you see young, and you mentioned you have seminarians in your congregation. What are some of the common, maybe mistakes is bad, but what are the common struggles that you find young preachers have?
Yeah. Well, we've already talked about one of them, which is trying to do too much with a particular pericope, like trying to convey everything they've ever learned, either for the sake of ego, which I would find is the minority report, or just for the sake of edification. They think everybody is going to be benefiting by my immense knowledge regarding, or in my study regarding this passage, and that just isn't true. They forget that they're preaching to like, um, you know, people that just had an abortion, or people that are going through a divorce, or people that are just being driven crazy by their teenage children who won't listen to them, or people that are insomniacs. Like they don't have like they're not in the same mental framework as the seminarian. They don't have that, and so so I think doing too much. I also think there's a psychological, and some of this they can't help, and none of us could help it when we were that age. There's a psychological limitation because they've not yet been to enough therapy or done enough work where they've understood themselves to the degree that they need to, and therefore their connections from the pulpit existentially are facile and shallow. And so they talk a lot about brokenness, the kind of white noise terminology. Oh, we're all sinners, we all struggle, and that doesn't mean anything. It just doesn't. And so if there's not an integration between them as theologian and them as sufferer and self-sabotager, they're going to not have anything to convey from the pulpit that has a lot of sticking.
Mm-hmm.
At
Yeah.
least in my experience, that's what I've noticed. There's just not a lot of depth there. But part of that, again, is because they're young. But part of it is because they should have done some work, and they haven't done it yet. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but I find that this cruciform ministry that we have, if you stick with it, and sometimes it's tempting not to, because it is, people think, well, you don't work that much, and you only are on really 1 day a week. I hear that from time to time from people that are 1/3 joking. And it's not true. Like what people do not realize is the soulish and crushing nature of this work that's always with you, and people love you for legitimate reasons and then really turn on you and hate you for illegitimate reasons that all have to do, mostly have to do with their own projections, and that can be very tedious and tiresome. And I think going through some of those things year after year tends either to calcify you as a preacher, make you hard as iron and terrible, dreadful, even tyrannical, or can soften you in a holy sense and give you not a bitterness, but what St. Paul called a godly sorrow that you
Mm.
bring into the pulpit that does help you to connect with people's agony as a preacher. And I hope that I've learned some of that through the years. And I hope
Yeah.
that the new seminarians, the new bucks that are coming up will do that too. But I urge them all, like, if you can, get to a 12-step group, get to a therapist, get to a spiritual director as soon as possible, because you are bringing oceans of pain and reservoirs of inner torment with you. And if
Yeah.
you don't realize that crap now, it will hinder your ministry and hurt your people. But if you do realize it, and some of that pain is integrated by the Spirit, it can actually benefit your ministry a great deal.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think of George George Eliot's Janet's Repentance.
Yeah.
You know,
Oh, yeah.
Edgar Tryon. It's and if our viewers haven't read that, go read it. You can read
That's
it
so
in a
good.
day or two.
Little novella. Yeah.
It's his ability to have grace and mercy towards Janet, who has wronged him and has come after him, but is in need of a compassionate word, um, is tied to his own experience of desperately needing grace
Yep.
and finding it, right?
Yep.
And it's that sense of you can't give something that you haven't received, um, and you can't receive it till, I mean, again, to go back to Luther, it's like, it really is life that makes the theologian. It's the struggle that really creates that. I mean, you talk a lot about, I mean, even just in this interview, I mean, you use a lot of psychology in your descriptions of things. And how is reading psychology, studying psychology, I don't know, going to therapy, how has that impacted your preaching?
Yeah. Wow. I don't even know, in a sense. I just know that what I learned when I was reading Freud in college, even though he was enormously antagonistic to Christianity and Judaism, but he wrote a brilliant book called Moses and Monotheism. It was his last book. Now, and some of it is bonkers, but some of it is really great. And what he said was the genius of Judaism and monotheism in particular is that it's hyper-integrationist. Like, you can't have little fiefdoms of gods, one that runs military might and power, one that runs sex and prowess, one that runs romance, and one that handles family, and one that handles justice, the other mercy. He said you have to have all of those themes brought into one unified whole. And he said that creates a whole different way of thinking about the heavens and thinking about the self and thinking about integration. And I was uh, helped by some of his insights, more helped by Jung's insight in terms of the integration of the shadow self and things like that. Not because of their genius in and of themselves, but because they were actually tapping back into, whether they knew it or not, and certainly Freud wouldn't want to have admitted it. They were tapping back into biblical anthropology
Right.
of this kind of dual nature of man as made in the image of God and also as desperately sick, and how those two things blend and interplay. And I always found that to be really fascinating because it begs the question of how is the self made whole and healed? And Freud, in his book, Society and Its Discontents, ends with that great example because he's an atheist, and he says that the laws of society, of high society, are necessary. So he thinks that primitive societies have few laws. The higher society, the more congenial and Brahmin-esque societies of finery require endless laws about where your fork goes, the dinner fork, and how you eat in front of other people and what you wear when you're eating in front of them. And there's a multiplicity of laws. But here's Freud's point in the book. He says, well, the problem with that is now you have to live with a million laws in your head all the time, dictating the terms in every situation. And he said, the more you have that, the more you break. He said the more you bifurcate between the pleasing self and the rebellious id that wars against all of them. And so he said, in the last few pages of the book, he says, so how is it cured? Because you need the laws to create sophistication.
Yeah.
But yet they kill you. So what do you do? And this is how he ends. It's so brilliant for an atheist. He said, we need the external spirit of love to hover close and heal and to mend the rift between the outward projected self and the inward damaged self. If only the external spirit of love would mend us. The end. And I'm like, all right, Mr. Atheist.
Yeah.
Because I don't think atheism is real. But what he was saying is we need something outside of us to deal with us and to mend us. However, he does that, and it has to be through a loving agency. And I'm like, that is actually a way of hoping for, yearning for, pressing forward to this gospel idea that we have. Well, what if it did happen, though? Like, what if the external spirit of love did fleshify himself and deal with us in the midst of our own alienation? And what if it means something? What if it mattered? What if it does forgive everything? What if everything is absolved? And so so for me, I just noticed that certain Christian themes were hungered for within the psychological enterprise. And that's not me saying that everything that Freud said or Jung said was great, because or Philida or whoever, some of it is crazy. But there's a lot of brilliance there too. And that brilliance helped me to connect to Christianity in a new way, realizing, oh, all of my inner tortures and torments too have been reaching out for something that has been, in fact, offered, graciously given. And so I just found that these were kind of unwitting friends, in a sense, that helped me see certain things about my life, but also ironically, and maybe contrary to their intention, lead me to Christ in new ways. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are things that helped me.
It's so good. I mean,
that's what we were talking about.
Yeah. So for viewers, welcome back. My computer died mid thing. We're working on getting some new. If you subscribe and you donate $1,000, we can get brand new equipment where that'll never happen again. So just saying.
That's a nice plug. I like that.
Yeah, there you go. We were talking about psychology, and I think, one of the ways in which I enjoy I think those guys are really good describers of the problem, but don't have real solutions, right? But they do, in general, aptly describe part of the problem of the human condition, and part of the issue of um, what it means to be human and what it means to be a sinner, although they wouldn't put it in those terms.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, I think that's right.
And
Yeah,
they have no actual solution for how to. That Freud quote that you just gave was just so incredible. I mean, and I'm not positing you as an expert on Freud, but I mean, do you think he knew what he was getting? Like, do you think he just had no idea that that's what he was? What, like, if only an external love could do this, or do you
yeah.
think he thinks? Yeah, Christians think that's true, but it's just not.
No, I think that I think that he had such antagonism for organized religion for a variety of reasons, that he was mentally blocked from actually seeing the genius of religion. Because, for example, his facile treatment of religion as wish fulfillment is so patently stupid that you'd almost have to be willfully ignorant or blind to affirm it. Right. So, in what sense is Christianity wish fulfillment? That we want these things to be true. That our deepest self finds great consolation in a text that says that there is something alienatingly wrong with us from birth, and the only way that it can be adjusted accordingly is for us to turn against the very short-shrifted ways we try to find pleasure and happiness, so as to reattach to a center that forgives us, but not based on merit, when all we live for is merit. I mean, none of those things fits within a wish fulfillment. But that's what he believed, because he was so blinded by his own antipathy. But that's what happens when you get blinded by antipathy. You sort of get stupid. And he's not
Yeah, I
stupid.
mean,
Freud's a genius, but he was blinded in those areas.
right. Yeah, wish fulfillment goes against the whole idea that Paul is saying this is the foolishness of the cross.
Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah.
it isn't what you mentioned that in that commencement address of we would like to preach Christ, you know, but we must preach but we are forced to preach Christ crucified. Like,
Yeah.
preaching Christ would be wish fulfillment, right?
Yeah.
A cosmic instructor. I mean, if the Gospels end in Matthew 7,
Mm-hmm.
that would be brilliant. You know, like Sermon on the Mount, you know, just comes in, Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. The end. You know, and that would be, I
Absolutely.
think, in some ways, kind of what you get at with the Quran, the Quranification of that's what you get is like, well, we're just here to tell you what to do. Now you know. If you want to do it, good. If not, judgment. You know, I mean, whatever.
Yes, Jesus is a more needling Moses. Now he gets much more introspective,
Right,
instead of
right.
just legal. And that, yeah, and a lot of preaching, I find, treats the New Testament in that way. It's sort of a litany of principles to apply to one's life through the coercion of one's own, self-coercion, that you're going to coerce yourself into um, new and fresher obedience. I've yet to see that work, and not damage. I mean, sometimes and that's what Luther used to say, that the most dangerous people are those who are obedient, because because they fool themselves into thinking that they create and cultivate their own legitimacy. And so it's anti-faith at that point. And so, but I think a lot of sermons lean in that Quranic direction of, like, we just need a more needling Moses, and Jesus is here to be that person. That, without realizing the only person to ever fulfill the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus himself, right? The only one to turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile, and take it all was him. And that's why the gospel has to end not with the Sermon on the Mount, but with the crucifixion for those who have failed to live by the moral maxims of the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah. All right. Two questions in closing. One, I mean, we talk a lot on this channel about the kind of and mainly because it's kind of, I think as Anglicans, we run into it a lot, is this Gen Z move towards kind of leaving evangelicalism, moving towards Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, higher forms of, and I don't necessarily want you to. I'm not saying that you could solve the whole thing, but I do wonder what role would good. And then there might be two ways to view this. What role does bad evangelical preaching play in sending them towards even Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholic denominations or structures? But also, what role could really good evangelical preaching
Yeah.
have towards preventing that?
Yeah, I think that shift, which is a fairly new phenomenon. I mean, there was a book in the early aughts called The New Orthodoxy, which kind of prophesied this turn. But I think having grown up in the era of deconstructionism, at least low grade, low level, assumptive deconstructionism, means that most people distrust or are cynical about family, religion, politics, uh, every arena of life, and so everything seems to have fallen apart, and we're awash in this sort of nihilism. And so any tradition that seems to fly in the face of that and offer something solid, stately, historically rooted, and even unchanging, as romantic as that is, because none of it's true, right?
Right.
So it sells itself on the romance of it, the romance of the idea of this unchanging, unblemished, kind of apostolically successed tradition is the Buddhists would call it a maya, and it's an illusion. It's not real, but it seems to be medicinal in the sense that it's going to key me into something bigger than myself, and therefore more solid than myself, more solid in my family, more solid in my surroundings. And I think a lot of people have a hungering for that, understandably so. My dissing of it is not in the liturgical and historical benefits. My dissing of it comes with notions of infallibility and self-purported unchanging. It just isn't. It's not accurate. Nobody can read the Council of Nicaea 2 and conclude that way. Or local councils that excommunicate people for crossing themselves incorrectly, or beard length, requiring beard length, and thinking that, and neither of us can pull that off, right? So for me, I'm dissuaded by the current romantic move. I actually don't think it'll be long-lived, but I think it is the mode and the energy right now. But part of that has been fueled by the kind of vapid hyper-pragmatism of so-called evangelical preaching, which is evangelical in all but name. It doesn't have the evangel in it. It's almost always hyper-pragmatic things. It's atheistic in a sense. It's just, here are things that you could do to improve your life. And of course, they add Jesus in there, sort of a booster shot. Jesus is the Gatorade to help you climb Mount Sinai. But Jesus is the one that is our model, that he did it really well. You could do it really well too. Here's some things to add to your life that would make it more fulfilling or whatever. And I find that anybody who had a steady diet of that, or could abide a steady diet of that for years, would of course want something that offered more substance and more solidity and history and omnitemporality. Who wouldn't want that?
Right,
and so
right.
I find that what they're actually missing, and this is, they think they've abandoned Protestantism or whatever that is to attain Catholicism. What I want to say is they actually don't know anything about Protestantism. Like, whatever they experience isn't Protestant. It's American pietism, but that's not Protestant. It's its own kind of odd amalgamation of things. But real historic Protestantism tends to be liturgical, tends to be sacramental. But the benefit of it, even in its like Anglican, Episcopal, higher church forms, is that it's not romantic about church history or itself. Because we believe, according to the Articles of Religion, the church can and has erred, right? That it's part and parcel of the church to err in matters of faith and practice. Right. And that is a huge benefit to us because it makes us not naive. And we're not romantic. But we still believe in historical continuity of a sort, as well as liturgical worship, as well as sacramentology. And those things are helpful, but I would say those things are not enough. You actually need the source and summit of these things, which is the word of the cross proclaimed to you week in and week out. And so my fear is that with any of these new romantic trends is they actually will not help you when life becomes life. In other words, when you're not in your 20s and everything is mostly good, your health is mostly good, your spouse, you're still attracted to them, you're doing really well, you may have your first child, nobody's poor yet, or at least you're getting out of poverty in your early marriage.
Right.
Life is great, but and I'll tell you, then you can debate about candlesticks and why you like burses and veils and stoles and chasubles
Right.
and chanting. But when you're 47, and you've experienced maybe an illness or a child now who won't talk to you, or your spouse leaves, or you have several miscarriages, you will not give a damn about candlesticks or Latin chant because it doesn't matter. To quote the movie Meatballs with Bill Murray, it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's
Yeah.
irrelevant. The only thing that matters is that the heavens are not antagonistic to you, and the evidence of that is the bloodletting Son of God who takes away all of your guilt at all levels all the time, and therefore you stand on gracious ground because of the sufficiency of somebody else, and that's all that matters. And I find that as long as that's communicated to me, I don't like. I'm an Anglican. I'm on the team, but I
Right.
don't really care that much. Like when I was in Ireland recently, I went to a variety of different churches, and so long as that was there, I can get by with about anything else.
Right. Right.
And so, my fear with the more recent turn is that it's largely romantic. I don't actually think that people have left a Protestant proclamation of the gospel to inherit something better because they never really heard a Protestant proclamation of the gospel.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that also keys in with preachers who, we can, hear the message of the cross so often in a very, abstract way because we're preaching that we start to get bored with it, and we think people need something different. They need something more interesting. They need something. Oh, people are leaving. We need to talk about. We need to change. We need to.
Yeah.
And it's on us to say no. I'm going to stay. It's my job to keep giving people what they need, regardless of how interesting I think
Yeah.
that is. Like the analogy I use often, my wife and I, we live in Orlando. We go down to Epcot a lot, and they have the Food and Wine Festival. And the Food and Wine Festival is always, it's great because it's always these bands that really aren't all that popular anymore. And we went one time, and Sugar Ray was there.
Nice.
And Mark McGrath was up there, and he said something along the lines of like, and this is what happens every time you're at the Food and Wine Festival. These old bands come in, and they play what they love, which is not their hits, because they're tired of playing their hits. The Baja Men, we saw the Baja Men, they didn't even do Who Let the Dogs Out because they're tired of it. And they want to do their cool song. And everyone in the crowd is going, we don't care about we want Who Let the Dogs Out. That's the only reason why we came. That's the only reason we're here. And Mark McGrath said at one point, hey, who wants to hear a new Sugar Ray song? And people, they always do the little cheer, like, woo. And he goes, I'm just kidding. No one wants to hear a new Sugar Ray song. And like right then they do like the little and it goes right into, and I was like, this guy, he gets it.
Yeah.
No one is here to hear the deep cut from Sugar Ray's album that no one ever heard, that they felt like people didn't really appreciate this song enough during our heyday, and now we're gonna make all of Epcot experience it. He knows people are here for one thing, and it's our job to give them that one thing, which is play the hits, and I thought, as a preacher, I can get all kinds of oh, this is a really good point, or this is a really interesting thing, or and it totally misses like, no, people are suffering and they're coming to church desperate to hear something.
Yep.
And if you pick that Sunday to go on your little hobby horse and give something interesting because you think it's going to solve some problem,
Yeah.
just play the hits. Like, that's your job.
It's true.
It's just continue to play the hits of Christ crucified for sins. And
There's
that'll
also
actually do.
oh God, I'm sorry.
No, that'll actually do its work.
Yeah, there's also a Gnostic impulse in the opposite intent, which is to say I have to dig up something that no one has ever thought or said before. I mean,
Right.
it's a very cute. Now, I don't mean that everything ought to be sort of pablum that has been said in the past, in the sense of you're just mimicking commonplace slogans and ideas, but at the same time, the wheel doesn't need to be reinvented. Like the cross in all of its gory glory needs to be represented week after week, and of course, creative ways, but creative that are textually oriented ways. And I think when we do that, we're actually we're being the preachers that we need to be, instead of these Gnostic kind of like, I have to find the secret password. I'm like,
Right.
or the secret, the secret that has never been. So whenever I hear a minister say that they are going to present something that's a novel idea, I always I'm halfway out already. I'm like,
Right.
I don't know, Joseph
Right.
Smith, how that's going to work out. Yeah.
That's right. But last question, and we've talked about this a little bit and touched on it, but what do you think are some of the most important things? And I don't mean kind of at a macro level, but on a micro level, week to week. What are some of the most important things, and what are some of the most important ways that preachers can prepare themselves? Like, not, you have the sermon, you're preparing the sermon, but how do you prepare yourself to give that sermon or to preach that?
Yeah, I mean, I do a few things. One is I always try to have in the back of my mind that I'm not an expert. I'm a student of the word, and maybe it's a word or a passage that I've read 1,000 times, but that doesn't mean anything, because I'm at a different stage of my life. I have different eyes, I have different ears, I can hear things that I couldn't hear before. I have pains now that I didn't have before, and so that enables me to be a student, constantly a student under the master of the word. And so I always have something to learn. I will never re-preach the same passage twice in the same way. I just won't do it. So I don't reuse old material in that way. I might use an old illustration from time to time, but I'm not going to reuse like old thoughts. I have to re-engage. So I always try to see myself as a student of it. I always try to go in prayerfully and humbly. So I will pray for a mind that isn't too closed about the passage or too fixed on on preemptive ideas. Like, sometimes I come to the text with an idea that I already really passionate about or focused on.
Right.
I'm like, oh, isn't this great? Because this passage basically says what I wanted to say anyway. I always find that when I come to the passage in a facile way, let's say I read it really quickly, I'm like, oh, it's about this. And then I frame the whole sermon in light of that it's about this idea that came to me like that. And then when I'm 2/3 of the way done, I'm realizing, oh, this passage isn't really about that at all. And then I have to change it last minute on Sunday morning at 4 a.m. So try to have praying for a sensitive mind and heart as I engage with this. But that kind of intercessory stuff is really helpful for me. Also, I find that getting feedback is really helpful for me. So that helps. In other words, feedback about this week's sermon will help me next week. Meaning, when people say, that was a good sermon, I don't like that. It's not helpful to me. That's because it's not specific enough. So I tend to ask people, what was helpful in that for you personally? And then when they tell me, and very often it has something to do with how it dovetailed with their experience or met them in a particular place of weakness, then I can hone kind of my pastoral applications based on that.
Or they say something that you never said,
Oh, my favorite story of that was once I was preaching at a different church, and the guy came up after me with tears in his eyes and said, he had a really thick Pittsburgh accent, and he said, Ethan, that sermon reminded me of how much my dog loves me, because like you said, our dogs love us unconditionally, and God is like our dogs that love us. And I'm like, there's so much going on here. I'm like, oh, okay. I preached on the taming of the tongue from James. It had nothing to do with dogs or love or anything else. And I'm realizing sometimes people just hear what they want to hear. He was so convinced. I evidently touched his heart in a deep way.
Praise God. Praise dogs.
So excited.
Dog
I know, right? I know. So exciting. Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, thank you so much. Where can people find you? How can people check out your preaching? And
Yeah. Then go to our YouTube channel. You just go and type in Grace Anglican Grove City, or we have a website with all the sermons on it. It's graceanglicanonline.com.
there's only one, I think, Grace Anglican.
I know there's a million of them. Oh my gosh.
There's a million of them.
I should have named it something far more creative, but
yeah, in 2006, you might have been like one of the.
I think
few.
maybe.
Yeah, you started the trend. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks,
and enjoyed talking.
Yeah, good to be with you.